Usually the music comes first on this channel, because after all, we're only in it for the music. But today, we're unzipping everything that came before the first note, because long before anyone dropped the needle, this album had already made history. A working metal zipper. The introduction of one of the most famous tongues in rock history. A censored Spanish cover, and collectors who, more than 50 years later, are still debating the smallest details. Look what I've found. Sticky Fingers by the Rolling Stones. If you were to make a list of the most iconic album covers of all time, there's a good chance Sticky Fingers would be near the very top. Not just because of the artwork itself, but because of everything that surrounds it. And that's exactly what this episode is about. Sticky Fingers is widely regarded as one of the greatest albums the Rolling Stones ever made. Later in this Rolling Stones artist arc, we'll take a deep dive into the music itself. We'll review the albums, rank them, and discover exactly where Sticky Fingers belongs. But today, we're looking at it from a completely different perspective. Not as a record, but as a collector's item. Because behind this sleeve lies a fascinating story of design, production, censorship, collecting, and perhaps the most famous zipper in music history. Let's unzip Sticky Fingers. What makes an album sleeve iconic? Is it the photograph, the design, the artist behind it? Or is it simply an album cover that, more than 50 years later, you still recognize instantly? Because that's exactly what happened with Sticky Fingers. Ask almost any record collector to name the most iconic album sleeves of all time, and chances are this one will come up sooner or later. At first glance, there's actually not much going on. A pair of jeans, a belt, a zipper, but that very simplicity turned out to be revolutionary. Because Sticky Fingers wasn't just an album sleeve, it was an experience. For one of the first times, an album cover became something you could actually interact with. You didn't just look at it, you picked it up. You felt the zipper, and almost everyone did exactly the same thing. They unzipped it. Sticky Fingers wasn't the first great album sleeve. It was one of the first album sleeves that became an experience. But who came up with such a bizarre idea? For that, we have to go back to New York, to the artist who, perhaps more than anyone else, brought pop music and pop art together, Andy Warhol. To understand how this album sleeve came to life, we first have to go back to 1971. The Rolling Stones had reached a major turning point in their career. After years with Decca Records, they were about to release their first album on their own label, Rolling Stones Records. And that meant far more than just a new logo on the record label. For the first time, they were in complete control of their music, of their image, and of course, of the packaging. Because if you finally earn complete artistic freedom, why settle for an ordinary album sleeve? The answer was Andy Warhol. By then, Warhol was already one of the most famous artists in the world, and the undisputed king of pop art. His work celebrated everyday objects, Campbell's soup cans, Coca-Cola bottles, bananas, things everybody recognized, but hardly anyone really looked at. Warhol showed that even the most ordinary objects could become iconic. So perhaps it isn't all that surprising that for Sticky Fingers, he chose something equally ordinary. No band photograph, no painting, no elaborate illustration, just a pair of jeans, but with one crucial difference, a real working metal zipper. The idea was as simple as it was brilliant. The only problem, no one had ever tried to turn an idea like that into an actual album sleeve. A real metal zipper built into an album cover. It sounds surprisingly simple, until you actually try to make one. In the early 70s, nobody had ever attempted to put a fully functional zipper into a record sleeve. That meant almost everything had to be invented from scratch. How do you attach a metal zipper to cardboard? how do you make sure it opens and closes smoothly? And perhaps the biggest question of all, how do you stop thousands of protruding metal zippers from damaging the records during shipping? That quickly turned into a serious problem. During transport, albums were stacked on top of each other. The metal zipper pressed against the sleeve, and sometimes even the vinyl, of the record above it. A brilliant design, but a logistical nightmare. The solution turned out to be surprisingly simple. Many copies were packaged with the zipper partially open. By leaving it slightly unzipped, the metal pull tab sat closer to the record label, greatly reducing the risk of damage. But that was far from the end of the zipper's story. In fact, for collectors, that's where the story really begins. Because the zipper on sticky fingers is much more than a striking design feature. For collectors, it's one of the most important clues when identifying a particular pressing. And that's when you discover that a zipper isn't just a zipper. Zip happens. So far, we've mainly looked at the story behind this iconic album cover. But the moment you start exploring sticky fingers as a collectible, something remarkable happens. You quickly discover that collectors don't start with the label. They don't even start with the matrix number. They start here, the zipper. And that's less strange than it sounds. Because while you might assume that every sticky fingers sleeve has the same zipper, that's simply not true. In fact, there are a surprising number of different variations. But before we dive into all the details, there's one important distinction you need to know. Most collectors don't begin by looking at the name stamped on the zipper pull. They start with its shape. Broadly speaking, there are three main families. There's the large round pull, the smaller rectangular version, and the larger semicircular design, which immediately stands out because it looks distinctly different. Only then do you look at the engraving. And that's where things become interesting. Among the smaller rectangular pulls, you'll find names such as Star, Clicks, Alpha, Court, and Double Diamond. The larger pulls feature names like Pan and Zip. Those aren't random words. They're the manufacturers of the zipper pulls. And that's exactly where much of the confusion begins. Many collectors assume that a particular engraving automatically identifies a specific pressing. But it's not that simple. The zipper pull tells part of the story, not the whole story. Think of it as the first clue in a detective investigation. Only then do you examine the sleeve, the inner sleeve, the record label, and finally, the matrix number etched into the runout groove. Only by putting all those pieces together can you determine, with reasonable confidence, exactly which pressing you're looking at. And I'll be honest, I never imagined I'd spend several minutes talking about different types of zipper pulls. Yet these days, when I'm browsing a record fair, I find myself looking at the zipper before I even think about the music. And perhaps that's exactly what makes a great collectible. It teaches you to notice details that most people would never even see. So far, we've only looked at the outside, the zipper, the sleeve, the small details collectors pay attention to. But the moment you open this first UK pressing, you discover that Sticky Fingers is much more than an iconic album cover. Because inside, an entirely new chapter in the history of the Rolling Stones begins. This was the first album released on their own label, Rolling Stones Records. After years under contract with Decca, the Stones finally took control. Not just creatively, but commercially as well. From this moment on, they decided how their music would be released, presented, and marketed. And a new record label, of course, needed a new identity. Or perhaps a new mouth. Because this is where the now legendary Tongue and Lips logo made its very first appearance. Today, it's arguably the most recognizable band logo in rock history, a symbol that's instantly familiar, even to people who barely know a Rolling Stones song. But this is where it all began. Not boldly displayed on the front cover, not used as a marketing tool, but quietly printed on the record label itself. As if nobody at the time could have imagined that this small logo would become a global icon. The inner sleeve deserves just as much attention. Where the front cover is provocative and mysterious, the inside finally reveals the band themselves. It almost feels as though after opening the zipper, you've been invited backstage. Even here, the design didn't stop. Open the zipper, and you're greeted by a pair of bright white underpants. Today, that detail might seem almost comical. But in 1971, it perfectly matched the sleeve's provocative concept. The illusion was complete. You weren't simply opening an album cover. You were literally unzipping a pair of jeans. As for the man inside those jeans, his identity has been debated for decades. Many assumed it was Mick Jagger, but the name most commonly associated with the sleeve is actor Joe Dallesandro, one of Andy Warhol's celebrated superstars. And perhaps that's the greatest strength of this first UK pressing. Everything comes together. The working zipper, Warhol's photography, the launch of Rolling Stones records, the birth of the Tongue and Lips logo. This isn't just a first pressing. It's the beginning of an entirely new era for the Rolling Stones. So far, we've focused on the UK edition, the pressing that started it all. But as is so often the case with iconic albums, the story didn't end there. Because while the music remained the same around the world, the packaging certainly didn't. Take Germany, for example. At first glance, the sleeve looks almost identical to the British edition. The same famous photograph, the same working metal zipper. But look a little closer, and you'll soon spot the subtle differences. A different zipper pull, a different record label, small manufacturing details that, for collectors, make all the difference between two seemingly identical copies. Things become even more interesting in New Zealand. There, the iconic top opening sleeve disappeared altogether after 1971. Instead, Sticky Fingers was reissued in 1973 in a true gatefold sleeve. The zipper was still there, but it was no longer part of the sleeve's construction. The entire experience changed. You were no longer unzipping the jeans. You were simply opening the album. And that's exactly what makes collecting so fascinating. The same album, the same music, but a completely different first impression. Each edition offers a slightly different physical experience. And yet, as fascinating as these variations are, no country departed from the original quite as dramatically as Spain. Because there, the authorities decided that the original cover simply went too far. And what happened next resulted in perhaps the most remarkable edition of Sticky Fingers ever released. After Germany and New Zealand, you might think you've already seen the most unusual versions of Sticky Fingers. But then there's Spain. In the early 70s, Spain was still under the authoritarian regime of General Franco. Art, films, and music were subject to strict censorship, and anything considered sexually provocative or socially undesirable could be altered or simply banned. The original Sticky Fingers sleeve never really stood a chance. A tight pair of jeans with a fully functional metal zipper was simply a step too far for the Spanish authorities. So something happened that seems almost unimaginable today. Instead of the famous jeans, Spain received an entirely new cover. No zipper, no denim. Instead, a hand with its fingers stuck inside a tin of syrup accompanied by an old-fashioned tin opener. The album cover was designed by John Pash and Phil Jude. An image that's every bit as bizarre as the original, but in a completely different way. The original cover is meant to provoke, to challenge, to push boundaries. The Spanish version is simply unsettling. Personally, I'd rather look at that man's crotch than a set of severed fingers. What does that say about me? And perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about the Spanish edition. It's not a cheap imitation of the original. It's a completely new concept. Even the title was changed. Sticky Fingers became Dedos Pegajosos, literally, sticky fingers. But the censorship didn't stop with the artwork. The music wasn't spared either. Sister Morphine, with its explicit drug references, was removed entirely from the Spanish release. In its place came a live version of Chuck Berry's Let It Rock. So Spain ended up with more than just a different cover. It also received a different track list. Even the contents of an album, it turned out, weren't untouchable. And that's precisely why this Spanish pressing has become one of the most sought-after editions among collectors. Not because it sounds better, not because the music is superior, but because it demonstrates how the very same album could take on a completely different identity depending on the country in which you lived. And perhaps no edition captures the history of Sticky Fingers better than this one, an album that set out to push boundaries and in Spain actually found them. Now that we've explored all the remarkable details of Sticky Fingers, there's really only one question left. Not, what did I find? But, where did I find it? The answer is surprisingly simple. I didn't find this UK Zipper edition at a record fair, not on Discogs, and not after years of searching. It was a gift from my father, and perhaps that's what makes this copy more valuable to me than any rare pressing ever could. Of course, I admire the music. Of course, I admire the iconic sleeve. But every time I pull this record from the shelf, I'm reminded of the person who gave it to me. And perhaps that's the most beautiful part of collecting. Not the rarity, not the monetary value, but the story a record carries with it. The music of the Rolling Stones has always meant something to me. I may not play their albums every single week, but I always find my way back to them. I guess wild horses couldn't drag me away. And that was Sticky Fingers. That was the Rolling Stones. The beginning of an artist arc that, over the coming months, will take us through many different chapters in the story of one of the greatest bands in rock history. Today, we deliberately left the music untouched, because that story deserves an episode of its own. But if today's episode has made you want to revisit Sticky Fingers, you can find the album, along with all the other music featured in this series, in the Spotify playlist. Don't forget to follow the social media channels for all the latest updates, because I will follow you if you follow me. Last week, we kicked off our Beatles artist arc with a Pick One episode, asking one impossible question. If you could only keep one, would you choose the Red album or the Blue album? Click the card to watch that episode. This is just the first chapter. The music is still waiting. Thanks for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.